Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us today. We have very limited time, so I think we'll just start off with some broader principles, and then I'm going to try to guess some of the questions that many of the people here may have for you, particularly being in New York and being really at the heart of the capital markets infrastructure for so much of Wall Street. I think I'll start off, given your experience and your position on the front lines of crypto policy formulation and regulation, just maybe for a status check from your standpoint, particularly as relating to the overall nature and of regulatory clarity and regulatory certainty. There have been a number of efforts by the SEC to share guidance about that tricky question as to when and under what circumstances a financial product, a crypto asset may be a security or not. And there have also been other communications by the agency to clarify the expectations that the agency may have for other aspects of the financial markets infrastructure. So how satisfied are you right now about the status of regulatory certainty and clarity, and where do you think most of the work and energy will be spent on providing more clarity for financial market participants?
So let me start by saying that my views represent my own views and not necessarily those of the Commission, and I think those are very relevant to that question. That disclaimer is relevant to that question because I'm not satisfied with where we are now. I think that we have taken some positive steps toward providing more clarity. We have set up a FinHub, which invites people to come in and talk to us. We're having a Fintech forum at the end of this month. We, several weeks ago, put out guidance, as you mentioned. So I think that that's positive. But on the other hand, I'd like to see some more definitive steps that are taken at the commission level instead of at the staff level. So far, all the activity has really been at the staff level. The only commission statement has really been the denial of the exchange-traded product application last year. And then there have been a number of enforcement actions also, which are to some extent, staking out ground. But we really haven't provided any commission-level guidance or a safe harbor rule, something along those lines is what I'd like to see. I think we might need a nudge from someone else like Congress before we would do something like that. But again, I think it's positive that the staff is thinking about these issues. They need to be thinking about it, and we've got a lot of people coming and asking us questions. So at least we're moving forward in small steps.
That's very interesting. One of the issues that you had mentioned had to do with the ETF issue. Before coming on stage, I tweeted out whether or not anyone in the Twitter sphere would have any questions that they would like to have you answer. And one person had asked a very interesting question about some of the issues that would be necessary in order to launch an ETF, specifically the question of market manipulation and steps that would have to be taken by industry in order to achieve comfort, certainly by staff, and the question obviously is still outstanding as to the commissioners, as to whether or not those hurdles have been overcome for launching an ETF product. Maybe to the extent to which you feel comfortable, what would be your expectations relating to the market and market manipulation, and or more generally, the launch of an ETF? Do you think that the time is right? Do you think that more additional steps need to be taken? And how do you view the topic?
Well, I thought the time was right a year ago, or longer than that ago, actually. But I mean, my first chance to comment on it was a year ago. So I think certainly the time is right, but there are still questions floating around the SEC that I think need to be answered as much as possible by you all. I mean, to the extent that you have answers that you can help us think through these issues. Market manipulation is a concern that people keep raising at the SEC, and other issues like custody issues, Those kinds of issues come up a lot, so to the extent that you can assuage concerns at the SEC, I urge you to weigh in and put your 2 cents in. I think a lot of people have actually written in on exchange-traded product applications, which is helpful, but continue to be alert to what the SEC is putting out there. Sometimes they'll put out some questions, and it's good for you all to weigh in on those questions that are more general, because that is all information that can really educate us.
So one of the more difficult aspects of regulating cryptocurrencies more generally is really keeping on top of all of the developments in the space in terms of both technology, in terms of financial products. And a regulator has to figure out a way to do that and to take that information and operationalize it as quickly as possible into some kind of workable regulatory framework. Right now, I mean, you had mentioned FinHub. I know that the CFTC and other agencies are also trying to figure out how do you harness financial innovation in a productive way. I know you've spoken recently about that, comparing us to some of our international counterparts. But how would one, in real time, take something, particularly when you look at custody issues, when you look at the fact that both certainly the staff have indicated the need to upgrade and to identify transfer agents and different sort of pieces in the crypto ecosystem, and to lay that out. How do you identify these new players? I know many of them are in our audience right now, and get abreast of what they're doing, and how can they demonstrate to regulators, other than through comment letters, that their tech is actually more than just a dream, and it's more than just a blueprint, and it's more than just a hope, but it's actually something that can be readily implemented and deployed with the right regulatory perspective, oversight, and partnership?
Well, I think one thing that people have done that's been pretty effective is just, you come in and you show us what your technology is to the extent that you can show it to us. That is fairly effective to actually see, oh, okay, this makes me more comfortable. I see how it's running. I see all the protections you have in place. One pushback that I get is that, you say, just come and talk to us. Well, coming and talking to a regulator or potential regulator is not really what someone wants to spend time doing, and a lot of people are pretty uncomfortable doing it. In fact, I had a police officer come in for something related to securities, believe it or not crypto, but another area, and he came in a little while ago and was talking to me, and then afterwards he went and told my staffer that he would rather be on patrol getting shot than meeting with the SEC. So I thought, all right, well, that makes me feel great. I thought it was being nice to him too, but I guess not. So, I understand it's difficult, but I would say come on in and talk to us, show us your technology, and then to the extent that you're actually engaged in a process of trying to get registered with FINRA or dealing with us, and you're getting asked questions, you've got to just be quick about turning around your responses, because I think to the extent it looks like you're on top of it, you can answer the questions that are laid out. It gives the staff and my colleagues at the Commission confidence that you actually really have thought through these issues and have dealt with those problems.
So one of the discussions, certainly as you know, over in Washington, D.C., is one relating to financial innovation and the proper role of the regulator in financial innovation. There's FinHub with the SEC, and there are the more traditional tools like no action letters and sort of an iterative process of communicating with regulators to keep them apprised of what they're doing. But there are a good number of people I know from the United Kingdom, and they're very proud of their regulatory sandbox. We've had in small pockets of the US government attempts to create a sandbox of sorts. If I could ask you, it's a little bit of a two-part question, because from a high level, regulatory sandboxes seem to be something that could be quite appealing, but we also have a very fragmented regulatory structure. You've seen whether or not it be the Fintech charter with the OCC or in other spaces, we have a divided government in more way than one. And if you want to get the entire regulatory apparatus on board, you have to deal with lots of different regulators. Do you think that a sandbox can be a useful innovation here in the United States, given just the fragmented nature of our regulatory agencies? And if so, how could the government and how could you and other commissioners with your colleagues in other agencies sort of find a glide path towards moving into that interagency coordination and cooperation to create a sandbox for the United States?
Well, I think a sandbox can be useful, although I've expressed concerns in the past about them, just because I think it means different things to different people, but to the extent that it means the regulator, kind of you coming into the regulator saying, here, I want to try this, and the regulator saying, great, I'm going to hop into the sandbox with you, we're going to do this together. It's like, you know, you really don't want the parents to be in, and I don't like to think of regulators as parents, but I mean, for the sake of this analogy, you don't want the parents in the sandbox building the sandcastles. You really want the kids to figure it out for themselves.
Also not having phones.
So I think that's really my concern, is that it changes the creative process if you've got the regulators there watching you. Now, if the sandbox is really a way for you to come in and say, hey, this is what I want to try, give us some kind of limited relief that we need to make this work, and you know, we'll be candid with you, we'll tell you what our results are, how this is working out, then I think that can be an effective thing. And you point out correctly that we need to really think about a cross-agency sandbox for some things. I mean, for some things, really the only rules you're going to be concerned about are SEC rules. But to the extent you don't really know whether something fits within the CFTC's box or the SEC's box, I do think there's room for that. As a result of the financial crisis, we've got the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is one way maybe to facilitate that kind of an organization or a sandbox. Commissioner Quintenz at the CFTC and I have been working on a number of issues, and so I think this is another way that, you know, we're thinking about how can we think about issues together, and so this is another way that we can do that. That's a little less formal, but I think there are ways like that.
Well, and I think Commissioner Quintenz had also mentioned sort of figuring out a way to think about the self-regulatory organizations or the industry bodies themselves to sort of speed that process along, which is an interesting idea. One of the things that I was struck by in terms of just talking to many of the participants here, running from the rain, is just how global the participation is for this conference. How do you feel about the state of American crypto? I mean, everyone in the world is obviously trying to develop new applications and ways to think through distributed ledger technologies and cryptographic applications more specifically. But do you feel that the industry here in this country is well suited to take on a competitive role and is poised to be a competitive leader given the other regulatory approaches that are being undertaken in different parts of the world? Certainly, when I talk to, I'm a professor, but when I talk to many industry and other foreign regulators, there is a sense of both pride when they stop by my office to talk about their approaches in different parts of the world, and a sense that they are going to be able to get in early on the ground floor in this new technology. What's your sense when you talk to the innovators as well as other regulators as to the health of the industry here in the United States?
Well, I think there's a lot of real enthusiasm, excitement, hard work here in the US. So I think from that perspective, I'm always excited to see the organic interest in this space. What is depressing to me, candidly, is that, you know, our country has always been a place where innovation can really thrive, and I worry that because we have not figured out the regulation in this space, whether it's to provide people, you know, the space within which to innovate, or to say, okay, here are the guidelines so at least you know what they are, that a lot of the a lot of the activity is happening offshore. And I never think that's, I mean, I think it's great that innovation happens all around the world, but I always want the US to be the most friendly country to innovation. I think we've become such a fantastic market because we've attracted people from all over the world who want to come here and invest their time and their talent here in the US, and I don't want to lose that in this space. So I am worried, and I think, you know, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's, you know, we don't care because we don't want that stuff in our space because we're too worried about it. But from my perspective, you know, you could end up missing the wave but if you take that perspective.
Well, given the fact that there's such vehement disagreement with you in this room, when you think about you know, applications of, you know, our fundraising apparatus, capital raising apparatus here in the United States, there have been attempts to innovate in terms of our own rules and laws, whether or not it be the Jobs Act, the upgrade of our Regulation A offerings. You are seeing some market participants who are attempting to move into that space with $50 million fundraisers, a turn to more private offerings. All those kinds of developments and working within the rules seem to push and to create other kinds of challenges. I've been struck at times as to how the debate in the United States about whether or not something is a security or not a security misses the deeper point of whatever it is, how do you want to just approach it? The technology, the things that would drive the value proposition behind a crypto asset are very different from the kinds of things that will drive whether or not Ford is going to be a successful company. The kinds of disclosures, the kind of information you'd want or wouldn't want is very different when you have a startup in its pure sense as opposed to a company that's been around longer. How does the SEC plan to or can sort of think through not just whether or not a technology is dangerous or not dangerous, but to also think through what are the adequate disclosures? I know Bill Hinman has put a lot of time into sort of thinking through the threshold issue of whether or not it's a security or not a security, but it seems like whatever that answer is, when it is a security, you then have to think through other issues, particularly with an initial coin offering or any other offering of a security. How do you think through what those disclosures should be to make it easy but also safe for the investor who may not be as well informed about the technology driving or supporting a particular coin or token?
Well, I think on the one hand, you know, our securities laws are designed to cover lots of different types of companies that do lots of different types of things. And so what we're trying to get at with our securities laws is you get material information out to people, things that they need to know before they invest, they need to know whether they're going to stay invested. Now, sometimes we do industry guides that are sort of these specific disclosure guidelines for certain industries. And so you can imagine something in this space like that because there really is a different set of things that you'd want to know about. But I think the general principle of trying to make sure that the people who are originating the project and have information about what the project is are giving that information to the people who are thinking about funding it, I think that generally makes sense. Now, you know, this is a time where we can also think about if we do want to do some kind of a safe harbor, we could condition the safe harbor on disclosures that are really tailored to this space. And I don't think that would be, you know, I think that's an interesting approach. I actually started out thinking that was not the right approach, but I'm more amenable to that kind of approach as, you know, offering a chance for us to really sit down and think about what people would want to know in this space. But then we've got to be very clear on how does something fall into this safe harbor. Because sometimes these offerings that we've seen in the ICOs that we've seen have looked a lot like your traditional offerings. So we've got to find a way to distinguish the two. But then I would be open to a safe harbor with more particular conditions on disclosure.
Interesting. Turning to some of the cross-border issues, I received, again, from many people on Twitter, there was a very large interest in the question of money laundering rules. Without going into all of the details, we do have an upcoming G20 meeting where there is an attempt for many of the regulators to think through money laundering issues. How do you, to the extent to which you can speak publicly about it, how do you view the coordination thus far taking place on anti-money laundering? And have you had a sense as to what are the driving wedges between any particular country's approaches to their money laundering and anti-money laundering regulations and rules?
I actually think money laundering is an area where regulators tend to work pretty closely together. So, there are questions about how the money laundering know your customer rules apply in this space. I think the market participants in this space have been really working hard to address regulators' concerns. And so this is an area that will be challenging for a number of reasons, but I see regulators working together on it. I mean, again, it's, you all think it's difficult in your space, but I can tell you AML, KYC is difficult across the industry and raises a number of challenges across the traditional industry as well.
Yeah, one of the more interesting things that some folks had mentioned publicly in Washington at an event was that the money laundering rules can even have an impact on regulatory sandboxes. So one of the things that people may or may not know is that even when you create a sandbox, it can be hard to share the information that's generated in a sandbox with an authority outside of the country in which that sandbox is located. And those challenges can be because of privacy information, but it can also be because of lawsuits. And if you disclose the wrong information outside of, to individuals in the wrong country, you could find yourself subject to lawsuits. But also the AML issue had popped up. How is it that from a cross-border standpoint, how can one facilitate information sharing, particularly when you have a platform that operates across borders, number one, like called the internet, or if you have a digital infrastructure that's operating across borders? When you have jurisdictions taking such different approaches and views on core questions of everything from data security, cybersecurity, privacy, issues that are not necessarily to the core or to the heart of the SEC's mission, but if the SEC doesn't handle those issues, then it's not going to be able to create a kind of robust approach for regulating the industry in a coherent way across borders. I mean, how does a financial regulator that finds itself in the space of being a data regulator of some sort, how do you broach those two worlds in your work?
Yeah, that's a difficult area for us, especially given Europe's new privacy rules. That's where I'm seeing it most right now. That's kind of where the pressure points are right now, and that's in the traditional space, not necessarily in this space. But it really is a challenge. As a regulator, you want to be able to get information to do your job, and you run up against these privacy rules. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that. And that doesn't say anything about the issues that are specific to this space, where a lot of people are coming to this space and they're hoping for some level of anonymity. And so how do you reconcile those things? I mean, I do think we have some conversations that we need to have as a society to decide where those lines properly are. But certainly there are lots of challenges, and the data that we collect now is much more, we collect much more data than we used to. We're able to collect it, so we do, and how do we handle that, and are we running into problems when we collect it? Those are exactly the kinds of issues we're working through.
One of the challenges that I think you've heard from industry, and certainly was an issue just as far as a couple of years ago with other regulators, is when a market participant comes to the SEC or to any other regulatory agency to say, hey, I have this great technology, and the regulator then wants to look under the hood, it creates questions as to how much of their IP do they want to expose, how much of that information can they share or even disclose in a public offering or any other kind of public document without facing challenges from competitors? I guess, how do you get over that hump? It seems to me that if you're trying to facilitate more, and I'll just bracket out crypto for the moment, but retail investment in general in capital markets so that people can participate more widely in capital markets, you have to have a certain amount of disclosure, but getting from A to Z can be very, very challenging. And it's going to become even more challenging given the nature of many of these financial services that people are seeking to provide. How does the SEC navigate that?
With great difficulty. To be honest with you, it is hard. I mean, one thing is if you're trying to raise money from people, then you have to tell them something. Right. So that's kind of on you to decide how much you want to tell people and whether or not you're comfortable doing a public offering where you have to tell people a lot. You know, there are some things that you can file confidentially with us, which is good. But even traditional asset managers who are managing money have issues with the SEC coming in and saying, "Hey, I want to see all your models, see what you're using, what kind of data you're using," and they say, "Wait a minute, you know, we don't know that you're going to not go out and use that and build your own hedge fund," and so we have to think about that too, and we need to think, what do we really need for our job, and what do we need to make sure that we understand the product that you're trying to sell or the way you're managing money. You know, we're not a merit regulator, so we don't need to know everything. But again, if you are trying to reach investors in our marketplace, we're going to tell you need to talk to them and tell them what you're doing. So that's always going to be a delicate balance. I think in this space, actually, people have been fairly transparent because a lot of this stuff is open source, and so you can see the white paper, you can go to GitHub, and so in some ways, this space may have fewer of these challenges.
Well, one of I'd read a very interesting paper that did say that some of the disclosures, particularly when individuals are disclosing part of their code or that some of those, it doesn't always work out and it's not always as accurate as it should be. Have your enforcement have your enforcement people made any observations about sort of market integrity in the market over time? Like, is there a sense that people are taking more care with their disclosures now that there have been more enforcement activities, or is there a sense that people are still feeling that the likelihood of detection is sufficiently low that they can continue kind of doing what they're doing, but they may not be as above board and obvious in their activities? What's enforcement saying?
Well, on the one hand, I think the enforcement actions have, staked out a position and said, look, if you're lying in order to raise money, we might tell you got to stop. And I mean, the enforcement division has lots of things to work on, but I think putting the marker out and saying, no, you can't lie just because you're calling it crypto and steal people's money. So that's good, but I think there are other enforcement mechanisms that are actually more powerful. We saw lots of money being raised in this space, people throwing their money at all kinds of things without asking a lot of questions, and then over time people said, wait a minute, we need to start asking some questions before we give a stranger lots of money. And so there's sort of a natural, organic move towards scrutinizing projects more carefully, asking questions. People on crypto Twitter, I always have said, it's brutal out there. And so people get taken down by one another all the time. And, maybe you could do it in a little bit of a nicer tone, but I think the general, that general testing each other is really healthy. And it shows that a lot of regulatory activity can happen without a government regulator being the one to do the regulation. And again, if you're raising money in our securities markets and you're lying, we're going to be there. So that is definitely true, but I think you should also police one another. That's really healthy.
And I guess our time is up, although I did want to just sort of add, there are all kinds of, as disintermediation sort of moves apace, there seems to be more opportunities, market opportunities certainly, to become a validator of some sort on the technology end. And, you know, it'll be interesting either through the self-regulatory space, as Commissioner Quintins is perhaps thinking through, or from the SEC space. How do you support those validators in one way or another, just so that just so that folks can keep score of what is legitimate and what is not in the market, so that those who are coming to the table with really good ideas are able to get the funding that they need in order to realize them. Really interesting space. But
yeah, I mean, I think you've got, you know, that's the beauty of this space, which is you've got a lot of smart people spread all over the world, you know, bringing talents of all kinds, and they're coming together and they're meeting in this space and they're cooperating, but they're also holding each other's feet to the fire, and that's something that I don't want to lose by slapping a big regulatory framework on it, and then everyone says, oh, the SEC is regulating it, so we don't need to pay attention. That happens in too many other spaces already, so we need to keep this grassroots type of activity healthy, because that's what makes this market what it is.
Right. I was going to ask at some point, you know, which is the cooler regulator, FinCEN, SEC, but I'll save you.
The cooler regulator? I don't think regulators should be cool, so.
Yeah. No.
I'll let FinCEN have it.
Okay, great. Thank you so very, very much, Commissioner.
Thank you.